Good evening. My name is David Morris. I'm chair of the Department of Physical Therapy here at UAB. And on behalf of our department's faculty, I would like to welcome you to the 10th annual Marilyn Gossman Lectureship for the Advancement of Physical Therapy. First on our agenda tonight is to introduce our team. Okay, do I need that? So I need to click that each time. Okay. All right. First up is our dean, Dr. Andrew Butler. Not here with us tonight is Dr. Jennifer Christie, director of our Doctor of Physical Therapy program. Our director of clinical education, Dr. Tara Pierce. Our director of residency education, Dr. John Lohman. Our Bergman Pinkston Endowed Professor, director of continuing education and community outreach, and director of our new graduate certificate degree program in primary care physical therapy for underserved populations, Dr. Donald Line. Director of our PhD in Rehabilitation Science program, Dr. Bill Reed. Director of our new Bachelor's of Science in Disability Studies and Rehabilitation Science, Christopher Hurt. Dr. Kara Bullard. Dr. Alex Avancho. Dr. Ashley Parrish. Dr. Patty Perez. Oh, I might point out she's our new director of student affairs. Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, Dr. Elizabeth Wiley, and Dr. Sherry York. I'd also like to recognize several of our adjunct faculty, Dr. Diane Clark, Dr. Jennifer Green Wilson, Dr. Kai Kennedy, and Dr. Carmen Capalugo. And then I'd also like to give a warm welcome to some individuals in the audience tonight who are members of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee. They're listed on this slide. They're going to be here with us for a full day retreat tomorrow. So this year we're celebrating 59 years of physical therapy education here at UAB. We're pleased to have with us tonight the first PT to be hired at UAB and the individual who was responsible for initiating the UAB physical therapy educational program in 1964, Dr. Joan Bergman. In 2017, the department established the Joan S. Bergman Pioneer in Alabama Physical Therapy Award. It was established to recognize individuals who have made significant and lasting contributions to advanced physical therapy practice, research, and/or education in the state of Alabama. Here listed on this slide is our past recipients. This year's recipient is Dr. Diane Clark. Dr. Clark is emeritus faculty in the UAB Department of Physical Therapy, where she served as program director for the UAB DPT program until 2019. In addition to a distinguished career as a physical therapy educator, she served in hospital and clinic administrative roles in Alabama. She demonstrated skills as a master clinician, specializing in acute care PT and wound management. She executed innovative and groundbreaking research projects related to quality management and leadership competencies, and she served UAB in a wide range of service roles. Dr. Clark held multiple elected positions in APTA Alabama and has a long record of service with the Commission on Accreditation for Physical Therapy Education. She continues her contributions by working with other UAB PT faculty members to develop a new graduate certificate degree program concerning primary care PT for underserved populations. She was the 2019 recipient of the APTA Alabama's Marilyn Gossman Award for Professionalism in Physical Therapy. and was a 2022 recipient of the APTA Lucy Blair Service Award. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Clark as recipient of the Joan S. Bergman Pioneer in Alabama Physical Therapy Award. Well deserved. No doubt Joan approves, right? So Marilyn Gossman joined the UAB physical therapy faculty in 1967. For the next 31 years, she touched the lives of thousands and fostered a legacy worthy of the endowed lectureship created in her honor. Our faculty, alumni, and friends raised over $100,000 to establish this lectureship, which was first held in 2014. Here are the past Gossman lecturers. To honor her as a visionary, the visionary she was, this lecture addresses a contemporary issue affecting the future of physical therapy. Tonight, after we introduce the 2023 Gossman lecturer, we will allow panelists an opportunity to expand on Dr. Dean's comments. We will then open up to questions from the audience, both here in person and those watching on Zoom. Our live audience will simply ask their questions, and our Zoom audience is asked to submit questions in the Zoom chat box. Before I introduce this year's lecturer, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Patrick Berner is a consultant, educator, and clinician who now resides here in Birmingham, Alabama. In addition to being a doctor of physical therapy, he is a registered dietitian nutritionist. He is owner and founder of Fuel Physio, LLC, and is on faculty at South University's DPT program. He is immediate past chair for the APTA Health Promotion and Wellness Council, is a delegate for APTA South Carolina, and is the catalyst for an organization called PT in the Community, whose mission is to positively impact the local underserved and disadvantaged communities that are visited by physical therapy conferences. Dr. Oscar Gallardo is program director of Fit Families at Rancho's Los Amigos National Rehabilitation and is adjunct faculty member at the University of Southern California's DPT program. He is active within the APTA California chapter as member of the board of directors, chapter delegate, and federal affairs liaison. Dr. Lowndes Harrison is a plant-based radiation oncologist who is board certified in radiation oncology from the American College of Radiology and board certified in lifestyle medicine by the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. Dr. Harrison has been in private practice at Gadsden Regional Cancer Center since 1996. He specializes in external beam radiation therapy, stereotactic radiation therapy, image-guided radiation therapy, and brachytherapy implants for prostate cancer for patients in Northeast Alabama. Dr. Kai Kennedy is an associate professor and vice chair of equity in the Department of Physical Therapy and Rehabilitation Science at the University of California, San Francisco. She received a Doctor of Physical Therapy degree in 2005 from Virginia Commonwealth University and has served on faculty at two other institutions in addition to UC San Francisco. She is the first physical therapist to be named Atlantic Fellow for Health Equity. So welcome to our panelists. Now, it gives me truly great pleasure to introduce one of my PT heroes, Dr. Elizabeth Dean. She is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Physical Therapy, Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia, Canada. Her clinical practice, as well as her research and publications, has focused on maximizing the health of people with non-communicable diseases or their risk factors, an area that is particularly relevant in the COVID-19 pandemic era. Elizabeth has been committed to establishing health competencies in the routine practices of health professionals worldwide, including physical therapists. She is co-editor for the textbook Cardiovascular and Pulmonary Physical Therapy Evidence to Practice, which is in its 6th edition. She was the 2019 Linda Crane Memorial Lecture. This is a lecture that was developed by the Academy of Cardiovascular and Pulmonary Physical Therapy to acknowledge an individual who has made outstanding and enduring contributions to the practice of physical therapy. She has also led through the World Physiotherapy and the World Health Organization 4 summits on global health and has led the publications of proceedings for each. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dean.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and I have to say, is this too loud? Maybe down a touch. Oops. Terrific. And larger than life. That's exactly how I got my slides to do. First, I want to say thank you to Dave Morris and to the faculty for their generosity and kindness. And, you know, there isn't such a thing called Southern hospitality. In the last 24 hours, I've been addressed as honey, sweetheart, darling, more times than I have in the last year. And my husband is very generous with this kind of hearing. So I'm going to go home and the bar has to be raised, darling. So thank you. It's just wonderful to be here, and the South is truly special. And my colleagues here are truly special, and you're going to be learning some reasons why. And I was delighted to meet with the students earlier, and thank you, because I know you've got a lot on your plate right now, but you're our future. You are truly our future. And I want to thank the panelists for having been attending today. You know, they have a lot of, they're very busy people, and to come and to reflect on these ideas today as these newcomers to our profession as well, and to those who may be literally zooming in. So I'm talking about this is what it takes to address societal health and equity, and are physical therapists ready? You could ask the same question of other health professions, but I have confidence in you, and we really fit in this piece. Now, to say again, you know, Marilyn Gossman's contributions is certainly worthy of a few more words. And a couple of the words that I resonated to, that Marilyn was not only committed to innovation. I can get this little thing working. There. I can't get this one. Not only was innovation and research in her mandate, but she went on to say that her commitment was to ways of propelling the physical therapist profession forward. Now that really resonated to me. It's not just about the research and accumulating research, but it's putting it into practice. And we know in healthcare, there's enormous lag time. Like in the medical literature, it's listed as 7 to 14 years lag time. That's really inexcusable. But some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is 46 years lag time, and some of it is 70 years. So we've got to do something about it and correct this. So knowledge, yes, is important, but we've got to be thinking about the action piece. And that's actually, I'm not saying that's going to be easy, but let's kind of get the knowledge right, or the piece right. Let's see if I can just, is it this one? No. There we go. But first of all, some of you may not know, it's a safely guarded secret, but I was born and grew up in Berlin. Right. It happened to be 4,220 miles from your Berlin. And we pronounce it slightly different. But I'm happy to be here in my city's sister city. But I'm actually here now in Vancouver, right up there. Everybody knows about Vancouver? Good. Okay. Now, I started my career, as I told the students, in intensive care. I loved it. I loved it. It's intense, it's problem solving, moment to moment. A patient's status is changing. I love the teamwork. We're working with a group of people and with all basically the same objective. And we moved the profession from just simply thinking about, ho-hum airway clearance to this oxygen transport pathway, which made it far more interesting in terms of diagnosing what the problem is going to be. And that work took me to many countries in the world, speaking and workshops and so on. But it was on a trip back from Singapore. Singapore had one of the biggest hospitals in the world at the time, 1,000 beds, pretty big. 12 dedicated ICUs, pretty amazing. And I was flying home and I thought, most of the people in those ICUs should not be there. Most should not be there. So who am I as a physical therapist? And in my profession, what is it that we can do to prevent this very preventable tragedy? And so I did like a 180. I basically, that work is still of interest. But we started a clinic looking at multimorbidity and getting the health piece right. And that was hugely rewarding. Basically, that's been my path since. It led to 3 physical therapy summits on global health, actually 4, but we didn't call the 4th one a global summit. And where we said, okay, we brought colleagues from around the world, 5 regions of the World Health Organization. We said, right, who are we? What are our values? What is our mission? And when you look uniformly around the world, well, we're the 3rd largest health profession in the world, other than pharmacists and dentists that have a different practice pattern. We exploit non-drug, non-surgical interventions. We then went to look at the health of, how well non-drug, non-surgical interventions address non-communicable diseases that we were all dying from increasingly in middle and low income countries. And you know what the literature says? It's the superior thing for chronic management of non-communicable diseases. And so then the question was, well, how do we put lifestyle and health promotion at the forefront of practice, no matter what patient comes through your door? It can be a bad back, but that's likely to be the least of their worries if they have high blood pressure or they have heart disease risks or diabetes risks. So those were very productive. It linked me with a lot of international colleagues. And as Dave had mentioned, we're very proud, our textbook has gone into its 6th edition, 4 languages, and now has a digital copy, digital version. And 3 editions back, we included this chapter, Epidemiology as a Basis for Informing Contemporary Physical Therapy Practice. So getting away from just focusing on bones and joints and spastic muscles, we really had to think about the epidemiology and risk factors that patient was carrying around. So, and I wanted to introduce you to Donna Fraunfelter, my partner in crime, for co-editing that volume. And she started the first one, and I joined her for the remaining 5. And so, on that path, I was a special issue editor for Physical Therapy Practice in the 21st Century, and New Evidence Informed Paradigm and Implications. And we just didn't want the contributors to, don't tell us more why smoking is bad for you, why poor nutrition is bad for you. Tell us how a clinician can quickly assess, readily assess these lifestyle behaviors and intervene. That's what clinicians want to know. They're busy, they want to be able to get, if they're going to do this, it has to be straightforward. And it was then that Dave Morrison and I crossed paths, and his team that I got to know. And this was probably the first article on nutrition by physical therapists in a peer-reviewed journal. There may have been others, but in a high-level peer-reviewed journal, Strategies for Optimizing Nutrition and Weight Reduction. I have to say this department has led the way in many respects. So very briefly, today's roadmap is to walk the walk. I want to bring the knowledge to you that we have been selectively ignoring or bypassing for decades. And I want you to really think about it without bias, without thinking about your own preferences or your own lifestyle. I want you to think about the evidence. So walk the walk regarding evidence to address our leading healthcare issues. And I'm going to focus on the nutrition-related non-communicable diseases and physical therapies fit to eliminate or mitigate their impact on societal health and equity, because they're very closely related, and to draw on the reflections and expertise of our influences. So first of all, the health equity achieved through lifestyle medicine was an initiative that was created by the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. And they had a mandate to advocate and address these conditions as a means of addressing disparities. And we're going to talk about that in some detail. But they highlighted programs that were underway through the National Institutes of Health for advancing population health and thereby addressing health equity, a relatively new concept at the time. And Jennifer Rook published this article in the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine and drew attention, and it wasn't a big surprise that African Americans have a higher burden of cardiovascular disease and diabetes and generally non-communicable diseases than other American ethnic groups. But what was provocative in this article was this. There is good evidence that simply eating a more plant-based diet could eliminate disparities in the non-communicable diseases. Thinking, wow, that's quite a statement. Some people could think that that's quite a leap. But you know, as physical therapists, we're interested in, well, how does nutrition impact function? After all, isn't that what we're all about? Well, a study of almost 55,000 women from the Nurses' Health Study, when they were looked at their diets and looked at their physical functioning, that there was a significant reduction in physical impairments in those women who adopted a more healthy and plant-based nutrition. So that was quite interesting, and there are being books now on plant-based athletes. And these are world-class athletes, many of them. Not that our patients want to look like Robert Cheek, but we have to kind of think about the power of nutrition in athletic performance. In fact, I do want my patients to be at maximal performance and capability, and so nutrition is one way of getting there. And this is very consistent with the whole food plant-based nutrition Eat Lancet Commission that came out in 2019. So, you know, there are many dots that are being connected. And when we think about getting the nutrition piece right, being important for other determinants of health, if you think about it, it does make sense that if a person is healthier, they have greater capacity to be in the workforce, fewer days out of work due to illness. They have more opportunity to be in school. They have greater participation, that they're not so sick, their carbon footprint is reduced, and their healthcare costs will be less, and that will be a way of saving more money and enjoying other things in life. So there's some direct and indirect ways that getting the nutrition piece right can actually impact the social determinants of health and help regulate and control inequities. I'm going to mention this book. I mentioned it with the students briefly, and actually Dr. Gallardo is from my part of the world. This Myth of Normal is now on the bestseller list, the New York Times bestseller list. And he, his son, wrote this wonderful book, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And even though we're not going to spend time today talking about so much about the mind-body experience, but that was the focus, mind-body. The work actually emanated from work with addictions, but talked about contemporary Western culture and raising children and the focus on behavior rather than on healthy development and understanding adverse childhood experiences. But they go on to talk about African Americans or other indigenous peoples worldwide that have endured significant trauma at the hands of others. And this has extended into generationally, compromising their mental as well as their physical health. So I just raise that because as an overlay to the other issues that are confronted by BIPOC groups. But this is well worth a read for those of you who are interested in the mind-body connection. So food, we do need to talk. And I propose that is not only time for an Academy of Plant-Based Physical Therapy, but I think we're overdue, given the strength and the weight of the literature. Neil Bernard, who is the founder of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, which I have to say was founded over 36 years ago, he published this article in JAMA 4 years ago, Ignorance of Nutrition is no longer defensible. Absolutely no longer defensible. And I know many of you, if I did a survey in this room about what you think good, healthy nutrition is, probably say something like this. People should be having more fruit and veg. Yes, sitting in the nuts and seeds. Less saturated fat, less sodium, less sugar. I think probably everyone in this room would come up with this list. But this is what you need to know based on the literature. Whole food, plant-based, low fat, no added sugar, no more than a teaspoon of salt per day, and 70% of the salt that the average American consumes is from processed and ultra-processed foods, and only 12% actually comes from the sugar. But no animal source foods. No animal source foods. Let's examine that a little. Let's unpack that a little bit. Because I appreciate I'm in the heart of barbecue bed, but I'm also in the heart of stroke bed. So I hope by the end of this lecture, you'll be a few aha moments. This is one line of evidence. This is how we look in the 40s and 50s. This is us. Our body compositions were different. The inflammatory biomarkers that you can't see. It's not just body shape, but the things that you can't see. This is how we were. Now, I'm not saying it was a lovely time. No, there were many social issues that had to be reckoned with. But look at us. We were different. And what changed? And these people, I have to tell you, they didn't obsess about what was going in their mouth every 10 minutes. They weren't obsessing about how much exercise they had. And I can't help but wonder sometimes, we're reading labels and doing this and doing that, and our lives are passing us by. Our lives are passing us by. And these individuals, I mean, had generally good health. Yes, their social environment. Yes, Dr. Gallardo would say these people were going to run into serious health issues given the social environment. But when you look at the attributes related to diet and exercise, it wasn't quite the same issue. So the American Heart Association has, as other disease organizations, has got on the bandwagon and say, oh, yes, our African American citizens are really in trouble, as well as other BIPOC groups. And they found that irrespective of where an African American lived in this country, that they were more likely to consume. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying a contemporary Southern diet. That's the word that's missing here. A contemporary Southern diet. So what's wrong with that? Well, it's associated, I'm afraid to say, with this range of nutrition-related diseases, heart disease, several cancers, hypertension, stroke, type 2 diabetes, obesity, gastrointestinal diseases, compromised immunity, renal disease, Alzheimer's. Now, these are actually not different diseases. These are just normal responses to adverse cellular environments. And there's a common pathway. And first of all, let's look at the characteristics of our Western diet. High glycemic load. This is how it differs from our ancestral human diets. High glycemic load, high fat composition, altered quality of macronutrients, low micronutrient density, increased dietary acidity, reversal of the potassium-sodium ratio. That's really important. Low fiber, consumption of legumes, whole grains, vegetables, and fruit. And it's inflammatory. And it's this inflammatory piece that's common to all those nasty non-communicable diseases. But why are they different? Well, there's an epigenetic factor that you don't have a gene for heart disease or a gene for type 2 diabetes, but it can be up or down regulated depending on the cellular environment. And so that's what food and our nourishment influences that cellular environment and whether any of these things manifest. But most Westerners have high inflammatory markers in their blood. So, but let's look at what's being done by our colleagues in relation to population health and nutrition. Well, Don Line, who you well know, and his team, they did this lovely model, described and published this great model to integrate health promotion and wellness and physical therapist practice. And so they developed a model that was very meticulously done and validated, and where the emphasis, of course, was on all the factors that influence patients' health behavior, and with looking at their needs, their wants, and their readiness to change. Because if the patient isn't quite ready to change, we have to certainly consider that. So readiness to change was a very important factor. And then there was a study, I think that same year, came out beyond the individual, population health and physical therapy. And what these authors proposed was a population-based framework for clinicians, educators, and scholars to improve health outcome. But what was important, they identified and reduce health disparities while controlling costs. So you can see the movement and the trajectory of the literature. Then next appeared a year or two later, Adopting Population Health Frameworks in Physical Therapy Practice, Research and Education by Don Matheson and Kai Kennedy, who we have here with us today. And again, another important step forward in the advancement of science. So if you look at the levels of promotion of prevention over here in this inverted triangle, it represents the relative number of individuals whose health can be affected. So if you look at the top, primordial population health susceptibility, and how they define primordial prevention is conditions within the social, economic, or physical environment that minimizes the emergence of factors known to increase disease. And look at the example that they cite, development of healthy eating patterns, but early in life. That's a big step forward, because you don't get your heart disease and your type 2 diabetes when you're 50 or 60. It's in the making in childhood, what we're exposing our children to. So, and that I thought was really important, because when you superimpose Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and you may have flashbacks to your first year psychology, but what was important about this was that we've got to have our fundamental needs, physiologic needs and safety needs met before we can have healthy attachments, before we have a healthy self-esteem, and before we can actually self-actualize in life. We have to have this foundation. So food and water and health are fundamental to Maslow's hierarchy. And then David Morris and the UAB team here published this work in 2021, Nutrition and Physical Therapy Practice Setting the Stage for Taking Action. What was particularly important about this article? Yes, they further advanced the guidelines for healthy eating and outlining diet and nutrition information. But particularly what was relevant is that they talked about why this fits into our scope of practice. To give physical therapists the confidence that addressing nutrition at the population health level is within our mission statement, is within our value system. We're not trying to be nutritionists and dietitians. Those are separate. What we're trying to do is health promotion, health healing, help maintain, keep inflammatory markers low to augment health and augment physical therapy outcomes in general. So I'm going to introduce you to some stars, some real stars. These are our heroes. The US has minted the leading scholars and knowledge translators in vegan science in the world. I'm going to introduce a few of them to you, because as you're hearing more about plant-based nutrition, you're going to be hearing more about these individuals. Dr. Neil Barnard, founder of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, Dr. Colin Campbell, who led the most in-depth global nutrition study in the world. Dr. Michael Greger, founder of NutritionFacts.org, and his 2 best-selling books, How Not to Die, How Not to Diet. Each of them has several thousand references from peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Dean and Aisha Shirzai, who are a vegan scientist, a neuroscientist, and look at nutrition and brain health and the use of nutrition to prevent Alzheimer's disease and to mitigate its effect. How wonderful is that as a non-pharmacologic, non-drug intervention? Dr. Michael Clapper, also an important knowledge translator, and his site Moving Medicine Forward. Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, who advances some of Dean Ornish's work on preventing and reversing heart disease. No drug can reverse heart disease, but diet and nutrition can. Dr. John A. McDougall, Making the Change. He wrote this important book back in the late 70s, a diet plan to give you the best chance to heal and stay healthy. Dr. Milton Mills, seminal work that I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides, and Dr. Dean Ornish's work in reversing heart disease as well as other chronic diseases with lifestyle. Why isn't this the standard of care for these chronic conditions? And yet pills and surgery, pills and surgery, pills and surgery, these are more powerful interventions than pills and surgery. I want you to learn a little bit about Dr. McDougall. And this was lessons learned from his practice in Hawaii. He was a plantation doctor after newly qualifying. He worked as a plantation physician for the Hamakua sugar plantation in the early 70s. And he was responsible for the care of plantation workers and their families who were from China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines, and where their diets were largely rice and vegetables. And these were his observations. For all three generations, their health reflected their diet. The first generation immigrants were trim, active, and medication-free into their 90s. They had no heart disease, no cancers of the breast, prostate, or colon, no diabetes, no arthritis. Children became fatter and sicker, and most of their grandchildren had lost their resistance to obesity and common diseases. In every way of appearance and health, they were full-fledged Americans. And with us today, there's a reason you feel that. And I have great respect for Dr. Harrison. I came across his work through actually a YouTube video clip. He had been interviewed at a vegan conference. And he really resonated to me because the others, yes, are great scholars. You couldn't get better. But it's those individuals in the trench, those who have said, yes, I've got to do something. I don't think he'll mind my saying because it is in the public domain. He had some serious health issues and said, I've got to do something about this. He read and read and read and started to go to some of the conferences where these gurus were speaking and to interact with them. So he made a huge change. It turned his life around. I believe his wife as well. I think she was taken to these conferences. And he concluded, it's the food, it's the food, it's the food, but throughout everything. And he is working just down the road. So I said, he has to go. You have to meet this man, this person who's implementing these principles that you're going to be hearing more about in the short time we have together. And of course, there are other plant-based physicians who have decided, yes, this is what the science is saying. This is speaking to me. I have to change myself. I have to change my practices. There are registries of plant-based physicians. Let's do the same. Let's start a registry of plant-based physical therapists. And I'd also like to introduce you to Dr. King Williams. Now, he's another hero. He was the first vegan president of the American College of Cardiology and did a term around beginning in 2015. And he has innumerable honors and awards to his credit. He's a very humble man and has done everything there is to do in cardiology. But I do resonate to his quote. That's repeated quite often. I really don't mind the thought of dying. I just don't want to feel responsible. So I'm coming back to Dr. Milton Mills. Now I think this is probably one of the most important contributions in terms of what the human diet should be. We're terribly confused. I don't know if you know this. We're hearing something different every day, and people have different theories. And it's not that complicated, actually. And Dr. Mills has really clarified some points. What he did, he took 18 categories he did this comparative anatomy of eating, and he compared on 18 dimensions the three general categorizations of mammals. So we've got the carnivores, the plant eaters, the animal eaters, and we've got the omnivores, which are plant and animals, and then we've got the herbivores. And very, very consistently, the carnivores had the same characteristics, the omnivores had the same characteristics, and the herbivores had the same characteristics. So where do humans fit? We are herbivores or vegan by design. When you look at these characteristics, we are vegan, we are a herbivore by design, and it's a choice. It's certainly a choice. But let me tell you, the literature is rather clear. The further we deviate from this biological genetic way that we're predisposed and need to be eating, the further we digress, the sicker we become. So think about that in your choices. The other thing that I wanted to say about herbivores is that in their natural state, these organisms, non-communicable diseases are rare. You put them in captivity, you expose them to a little bit of the Western diet, they start developing the non-communicable diseases. It's pretty compelling. It may not be a randomized controlled clinical trial, but I have to tell you, those observations are pretty compelling. And another line of evidence, the blue zones. Now, these are areas of the world where individuals live often to not only 100 years of age and beyond, but with little end-of-life disability or illness. Imagine it. You know, you'll be skiing when you're 105, and medical care will be all about orthopedics for people, you know, having accidents at that stage of their life. Of course, yes, family connection is very important, not smoking. But what do we see in all of these is that plant-based diet is common to all of them. Whole food, legumes is all of them. So, and then of course, now the studies come out about meat consumption and risk of several diseases. And they go on. There are many of them. This was an analysis of almost 500,000 people. And in 2004, a university professor from the University of Toronto made a very articulate argument for why meat eating was associated with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And of course, there was a lot of people were very skeptical at the time. Oh, how could this be? And but you know, it was very reasonable the way he articulated his thinking. And lo and behold, within 20 years, what was coming out in the literature? Meat consumption and risk of incident dementia. Not only that, but it was a double prion disorder. And prion is the genetic abnormal folding of DNA that goes awry with VTD that was established. So to address health equity, you need to address actual and perceived disparities. So African Americans, as we mentioned, have higher incidences of all the non-communicable diseases. They have the highest self-reported meat consumption and the lowest vegetable consumption among ethnic groups. Animal source foods are believed to be better tasting and more nutritious than plant-based. And the issue of food deserts and food swamp neighborhoods, which I'm sure you've heard about, are often blamed for this disparity. And access to fruits and vegetables will not promote health equity if these foods are not valued by the community. So there's a huge amount of education that needs to be done in valuing these healthy foods. And also the complaints about the perceived high cost of plant-based eating actually reflects the low value placed on these foods. I'm going to show you some data where actually you can save a lot of money by eating plant-based. Diet is the leading killer. Dr. Michael Greger, many videos on his on nutritionfacts.org, but I wanted to bring this to your attention. 1977 was a turning point in American history. You thought the Civil War was important. This one's pretty important, but this was a turning point. This is the statement of Senator George McGovern on the publication of the dietary goals for the United States. The simple fact is that our diets have changed radically within the last 50 years with great and often very harmful effects on our health. These dietary changes represent as great a threat to public health as smoking. Too much fat, too much sugar or salt can and are linked directly to heart disease, cancer, obesity, and stroke, among other causes. Dr. David Hexton, professor of nutrition at Harvard, weighed in. The diet of the American people has become increasingly rich in meat and other sources of saturated fat and cholesterol, and in sugar. Most of the health problems underlying the leading health causes of death in the United States could be modified with improvement of diet. Where did these guidelines go? Why did this not change coming from public health? Why did they not change the dietary landscape? Because of the strength and the power of the corporate influences. The livestock people weighed in, the Cattlemen's Association weighed in, the sugar people weighed in, the eggs, the poultry, And they came on so forcefully that, believe it or not, the public health authorities acquiesced and modified the wording and the content of the food guidelines. The public health is supposed to have your best interests in mind, not the profits and the sales that will be made by corporations. They should have the public's best interest in mind. So is it surprising when these food guidelines got released, people said I should be eating this and this and this and this, and then that was perpetuated through the guidelines until this day. And I'm going to show you very shortly what those guidelines are today. Can lifestyle change reverse coronary heart disease? Dean Ornish's initial work, 1990. We're talking 33 years ago. And because it was shown objectively with angiographic evidence that in 82% of their experimental group, their atherosclerosis regressed. Some individuals, it was entirely eradicated. Yes, it was a lifestyle program. Yes, diet wasn't the only thing, but it was a very critical and important piece of a fat vegetarian diet. Why did this not change? Why did this not create a huge turning point in the way in which we were thinking about heart disease? This study has been repeated many times, and it's the effect of a single fat meal on your endothelial function. This is very serious because they discovered that this dysfunction on your endothelial, which lines your vasculature, that this high fat insult to your arteries actually is an independent contributor to atherosclerosis. So it's not just the cholesterol, it's this damage that you create in the endothelial tissue from a high-fat meal. So it's, you think, well, what's one high-fat meal? Why does that matter? Well, if breakfast is high-fat, and then lunch is high-fat, and then dinner is high-fat, you've got a problem. You're setting yourself up, or we're setting our children up for heart disease, or for any of those other non-communicable diseases, because they all involve the vasculature at some point. And so one might say, well, yes, Elizabeth, that's kind of true. And yes, but let's do the moderation route. Moderation doesn't work. Caldwell Esselstyn, he wrote, the high-fat American diet is responsible for an epidemic of coronary artery disease. A plant-based diet with less than 10% fat will prevent coronary disease from developing or progress of existing disease, and even reverse the disease in many patients. He states unequivocally the American Heart Association has failed to show strong leadership on the issue. We as physical therapists, we're going to do it. We're going to show some strong leadership. And despite the strong evidence in favor of reducing both dietary fat and serum cholesterol, Americans continue to increase their consumption of fat. And he goes on to say that, all our special occasions tend to have even more fat and more sugar. So we're kind of killing ourselves even in our happy times. It's clear, he concludes, that we live in a toxic food environment. Neil Bernard, he weighed in and he said, well, I have a problem with moderation with my patients because the notion of moderation is typically in reference to unhealthy foods. You never hear somebody say, well, don't eat so much broccoli. You don't hear that very often. But here the notion of moderation is in reference to unhealthy food. Use of the term in moderation implies that a patient, to a patient, disease in moderation is okay. High blood pressure in moderation is okay. A little heart disease, a little diabetes, or a little Alzheimer's, it's okay. He doesn't go there with his patients. He says, I cannot. In all true, knowing what I know about the literature, recommend in moderation. Just yesterday, an important meeting in Washington with the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, and speaking on improving nutrition and tackling disparities. Just yesterday, the Physicians Committee is advocating for several changes in the next food guidelines. Focus on science and end the exaggerated promotion of meat and dairy products. Use clear language describing the relationship between foods and risk replace the on my plate icon for icon protein group with a legume group and remove the dairy altogether. The dairy had to go. So changing the dietary guidelines could help reverse diet-related diseases that disproportionately affect Americans of color. And as I said, this came out a few years ago, the diet review by Harvard University. I mean, it's just crazy making all these diets and nutritional regimens. I mean, as health professionals struggle with this, it's no wonder the public gets so confused. But keep calm. It's just not complicated. And now we're all into personalized medicine and personalized nutrition. But you know what? Most of us are the same. Most of us are not special needs. So let's kind of look at the big area under the native part of the curve and think about those things that are going to heal and nourish us and promote our health. When the Mediterranean diet was pitted against the low-fat vegan diet, the low-fat vegan diet was superior in many dimensions. In most dimensions, blood pressure decreased in both, but a bit more on the Mediterranean. So surely this then should become the new gold standard. The Mediterranean diet was probably the most studied diet in the world, and it has good health outcomes. It has very good health outcomes, and it has become a gold standard. When people wanted to study dietary regimens, they'd often compare it against the Mediterranean. But now we've got compelling evidence, and you might say, well, is one study adequate? This was a randomized crossover trial. It's one of the strongest research designs. So yeah, certainly replicate it, but I think the findings will be very, very comparable. So traditional versus contemporary, I made that a Southern diet. African Americans face unique challenges because of one being the preference that aligns with the tradition of soul food. No problem with soul food, but traditional soul food have many healthy components. Fruits, vegetables, collard greens, sweet potato, tomato, dried beans, watermelons, blackberries, and corn, okra. Contemporary Southern diet is high in fat, sugar, sodium, with prominent use of high-fat meats, the main dishes, and use of deep frying cooking techniques that add calories and sodium. So I have a few resources in our remaining slides. The harms associated with eating a more Southern style diet. Michael Greger reviews all the contemporary literature in a very short video. It's probably only 15 minutes. And what would a talk on nutrition be? Everybody's crazy about the gut microbiome these days. And of course, now there's the gut microbiome in stroke, and there's the gut microbiome in heart failure. What's happening in the gut microbiome in diabetes? Well, basically, it's all the same pattern. They're related. So, if we kind of feed our microbiome and treat it a little better, it needs more macronutrients, it needs more fiber, it needs more micronutrients. And we're starving with the Western diet, our microbiome. And the problem, one of the problems I've seen has been corporate influence, as was shown back in 1977. Interfering with the legislative process, using front groups to act on their behalf, questioning even very valid science, creating confusion with the public, and appearing responsible in the eyes of the public, journalists, and policymakers. These are really ethically questionable behaviors if we really have the public health in mind. So, how corporate interests have succeeded in defining what's healthy. On learning, for example, if a person is a vegetarian or a vegan, the public, as well as health professionals, inevitably ask, well, where do you get your protein? Where do you get your calcium? Where do you get your iron? Where do you get your energy? Great sources of these nutrients. And relevant questions those who consume variants of the standard American diet. Where do you get your fiber? Where do you get antioxidants? Where do you get your potassium? How do you protect yourself if you're not having antioxidants? Where do you get your alkaline base from? These are more relevant questions, but seldom get asked because we're so kind of brainwashed into thinking that we understand and know what a healthy diet is. So again, Michael Greger has torn the dairy industry's misleading study designs to shreds, but they always have studies to support dairy. He's also gone to task with the meat industry and their misrepresentation of the science to suit their pursuit of sales and profit. And I've been following, I review for a number of nutrition journals, interestingly enough, and one is called Nutrients. And I mean, it's just appalling what these corporations are doing in terms of adulterating the food that you consume. The processing, the ultra processing, making foods hyper-palatable, actually looking at neural changes, your dopamine responses to certain combinations. They regulate the combinations of fat, sugar, and salt to see which will stimulate the pleasure centers of your brain, because this food becomes addictive. Processed food and ultra processed foods become addictive. Does the public know this? You know, is this being brought to their attention? I'm all for corporations, and I've benefited in my life, but it requires transparency and accountability, and that's what's missing. So, you know, the junk food marketing, and the issue is that they're targeting communities of color, which is despicable. You know, it just goes on and on, but they're using the same tactics that the tobacco industry used several decades ago in their marketing practices, an explicit goal of increasing junk food consumption among, and they've targeted African Americans and the Latinos. Is that ethical? Should we be supporting this? And our children are being exposed to this. Food marketing is one serious obstacle to healthy eating patterns that can help prevent these disease risks. Yet almost no marketing is for foods and beverages that families should eat more of: vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. So governments do need to set rules. I'm not a big regulator, but there needs to be rules, and corporations need to follow those rules. You know, we must take responsibility for our health, but the menu and the reasonableness of alternatives is set by our society and government. So, you know, you may not have access, or a community may not have access to certain foods. That's not exactly by accident. It's not that government's withholding that, but they've given priority to the industries. A quick word about when you compare the economical healthy diets, including a lean animal protein, costs more than using extra virgin olive oil. Basically what it was, a comparison of an economical version of the government's My Plate and a plant-based olive oil. And they kind of made them comparable in a number of ways. The economical version of the My Plate cost almost $750 more a year per person. And that's a lot of money, my friend. That's a lot of money. And we are talking about people low income, marginalized, poverty. Don't you think that $750 a year per person, not only improving their health, but improving their resources, might be a worthy pursuit? Nutritional renaissance in public health, again, a word by Dr. Campbell, who says that nutrition is more efficacious and far more affordable in maintaining and restoring health than all the pills and procedures combined. So reset your taste buds. If you're looking for information for yourself, your family, your patients, Dr. Clapper speaks a wonderful lecture on the easy way to switch to a plant-based diet. Dr. Greger has his daily dozen, all evidence-based. This is a wonderful article, The Potential for Plant-Based Diets for Promoting Health Among Blacks Living in the United States, being culturally relevant and culturally attentive and attuned. A number of very important resources. And the Vegan Family Cookbook. I mentioned Anna Pippas. She happens to be from my part of the world, from my city. No conflict of interest. Anna and I have never published together, collaborated together, or had any other interaction. But her book is really very helpful. It's for people wanting to move to a vegan diet. She, in addition to living in my community, she has a small family. She's an environmentalist, and she's an animal rights lawyer. And I have gifted this book again, not trying to sway the discussion this afternoon, but I have given a copy to each of the discussants. And so a plant-based diet to conclude, to advise, consult, support, provide agency to change over 4 pillars within the profession: clinical practice, professional and continuing education, research, but importantly, for the policymakers. We had some great discussions with the students, policymakers, those people that can, we need people on the world stage, on the national stage, within the profession and at other levels to help ensure that we do keep public health initiatives and corporations in, they cannot be at the same table. Wonderful game changers. Anybody seen the YouTube Game Changers? Excellent video. All these scholars are speaking. What the Health, another excellent documentary. Milk's White Lies from Dairyland, Cowspiracy, Eating Ourselves to Extinction. And these are not, left-wing radical. They talk about the literature. So to conclude, plant-based nutrition is win-win-win-win-win. Win-win. Oh. Individual, the family, the community, the country, the environment benefits, animals benefit, and the climate benefits. And so what I had just hoped today, we didn't have a long time together, and we directed our discussion toward addressing nutrition-related non-communicable diseases as physical therapists, and how we can mobilize and create discussion and discourse and dialogue about how we can really serve our patients by making the changes, in my view, that need to be made. And I believe physical therapists are quintessentially well positioned, given where we are in terms of health profession, that we spend prolonged treatment times with patients, sometimes over days, weeks, or months, a lot of opportunity for teachable moments. And to mitigate or eliminate the impact on societal health, and to help reduce inequities, and to draw on the reflections of our panel in this discussion. So we are truly powerful beyond measure. We are, sometimes I think our professional identity from our origins was very closely linked, to the medical profession. And now you know who you are as a professional and where we fit in terms of non-drug, non-surgical interventions. So just to conclude with a quote from Margaret Mead, as you know, a very famous, probably one of the most well-known American anthropologists. And she acknowledged a small group of thoughtful people could change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dean. And I'd like to ask the panelists to come up to share their thoughts.
Turn this one off. Shall I trade this one in?
I think that you can just go sit up there with them and use the microphone. Okay. Okay, so we have asked our panelists to share their thoughts up to 5 minutes. And Dr. Berner, could we start with you, please? You need to. Are you guys fixing it? Thanks.
All right, you can hear me? Fantastic. So Dave, I only get 5 minutes. That's really tough. Okay. Trying to decide kind of where to take this. I could play devil's advocate. I don't want to go on that. I'll give you my personal, not beliefs, but I will say, I drank 2 cups of milk a day, 2 eggs a day, and I had a pretty good filet mignon a few days ago. So I'm gonna, kind of think what that looks like a little bit, and that being a registered dietitian and being well versed in the literature as well. One thing I do want to know, there is a significant difference, I think, and it's important to point out in terms of nomenclature and terminology, right? Plant-based does not mean vegan. Vegan can be plant-based, but plant-based does not mean vegan. So just to kind of maybe clarify me that, because, an individual like myself, who I believe follows more of a plant-based eating pattern, it's a foundation of plants. I would say traditionally that is 85% of what I eat day to day is plant-based, but I do kind of sprinkle in other food sources as well. So just kind of a clarification point there, because you'll see just some misconceptions, I think, in the media and how things are portrayed. One thing I do want to just mention, and we can come back to it because now I feel really louder. Okay. A couple of things, and we'll kind of see how the conversation goes, but things that I think are important to touch on as we look at this topic are what I term and what Dave and Don and I had termed in our PTJ publication were things, determinants of healthy eating. Okay, it's good to share the research. We know that telling people to eat more fruits and vegetables doesn't really do anything. There are barriers and facilitators to why people choose to eat the foods that they eat. And that's really in many cases where the conversation needs to be had. And I think a lot of that has to do with health equity components and how people access food and the foods that they can actually access. So that's one component that you can really dive into. The other component is, what can we actually do clinically? I mean, how can we actually give some clinical utility to this? What can we actually do? And from a physical therapist perspective, and it's really hard to give general recommendations in terms of a physical therapist should implement nutrition into practice this way, because it differs vastly state to state in what you can actually do. We've got exemptions here in Alabama that allow physical therapists to have a good conversation, but if you go next door to Georgia, you've got practice exclusivity, you've got exemptions that we do not fall within. So it's very difficult to give generalized recommendations to a physical therapist how to have this conversation when it differs significantly in many cases state to state. Just pass it.
Dr. Kennedy.
Hi, everybody. I'm kind of abruptly on me. I don't know how. Thank you for the thought-provoking talk. I'm going to preface this by saying I'm from the South. I'm from the Stroke Belt. I'm from the Barbecue Belt. My dad's from down the road in Anniston. My mom's from Richmond, Virginia, which is where I'm from. I also preface this by saying my dad had a heart attack and died at 53. My mom is alive and kicking. So I need to get all that off my chest in case I get emotional. You'll know where I'm from. I really appreciate this conversation about the contents of what we eat, but more specifically about the systems that bring them to us, right? And so I'm not a dietitian, I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not studied in this area, but I am going to quote a couple of books that I read. And the one that really opened the door for me was The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan. And he talked a lot about the history of the food big food, if you will, and food regulations in the United States. For example, corn. Corn was an easy to grow food that could feed a growing country full of people, right? So it was subsidized for farmers to grow the corn, and then the farmers wanted to get those subsidies, so they made all the corn, too much corn, and we had to figure out how to use all the corn. So what do? We fed it to cows. Cows eat corn? They will, right? But they usually, what, chew on cud, grass, right? That's the thing that they eat that makes them healthy. So then if the people are going to eat the cows that ate the corn, that were unhealthy because that was not their diet, what implications does that have on us, right? That's like decades and decades ago. You can fast forward to now and have a similar conversation, for example, about food deserts, right? You can have conversation about what foods are available in which communities and to whom and why, right? Why low income foods look a certain way and higher income foods look a different way, right? Who has access to those different things? So it's difficult for me to just jump straight to what we should and shouldn't eat without talking about how decisions were made about what's available to us. The cultural implications, and I'm glad that that was raised as well, because that we talked a lot about African Americans today, but I do a lot of international work, and the same conversations are had in Native American populations about fry bread, or in Latin populations about tortillas, right? Or in African populations about the banku or the fufu or whatever it is that they have on their plate. So this isn't just an issue specific to one group of people. This goes across the board. And I'm curious how those of you on the panel feel about the approach of fresh, local, and whole, as opposed to the banana that came from Chile 3 weeks ago. And you're gonna bring it home and wait for it to get right? That's really different than picking the orange off your tree in your backyard. And so I'm curious too what your thoughts are about that piece. And I've got some other stuff written down, but those are the things that I might start with. So I'm stop abruptly too.
Dr. Harrison.
First, come on. Can you hear me? Now, there we go. So I just want to thank you so much for including me to this lecture. Thank you very much. It's exciting for me to hear you young people get exposed to this information, because I didn't learn about it until it was practically too late. I'm a radiation oncologist. I work in Gadsden up the road. And in many ways, you and I are kindred spirits. We saw professions where we saw patients day after day after day, where we can make an influence. And so where Dr. Dean had mentioned earlier that the students are our future, you really are our future. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but moderation does kill. And if you take a step into my clinic, you will see the posters on the walls. That message is constantly presented every turn in the cancer clinic. That moderation really kills, and what Dr. Dean is telling you is true. It's the truth. This is the key to turning our healthcare around. And I know that's hard to digest. I have on my wall, for instance, how many here have seen or been to nutritionfacts.org? Anybody? Nobody. I strongly recommend you go to nutritionfacts.org. Dr. Greger has amassed thousands of short videos on any sort of health issue you might encounter, any sort of food you might encounter. Little short videos, 2 to 5 minutes long, will blow your mind that what Dr. Dean is telling you is not hooey, wishful thinking. It is real. There is science behind what she is saying. And so if any out there are struggling with health issues, find one of those books, Dr. Esselstyn's book, Dr. Ornish's book, Dr. Furman's book, Neil Bernard's book. It really doesn't matter. The message is the same. It does not matter what ails you. The food is what's killing us. And so I strongly urge each and every one of you to study this very, very diligently and address your patients with it, because you are in a unique position where you will see patients over and over and over again, and you can make an impact.
Dr. Gallardo. Yep, there you go.
All right. You guys hear me okay? All right. Buenas tardes, good evening. So again, just thank you so much for that talk. It was just amazing to hear all this information. Again, where I wanted to go with my comments, and I also took notes, just like everyone did. I took a lot of notes, but I'll start with this. I'm a clinician, primarily a clinician. I'm not a researcher. I don't consider myself a researcher. Yes, I've done research, I teach, but in my heart, I'm a clinician and I always will be. And so I take this information, and as I'm listening to this information, as I read any journal article, my main thought process is, okay, so what? How do I bring this to patients, right? So I want to actually go back to something that you all saw up in the slides, and then I'll kind of talk a little bit more about it. Dr. Dean had a quote there from one of Dr. Esselstein's work in regards to nutrition, and you read the first sentence, but I actually want to read the second sentence that was up there that you didn't read. And the second sentence said, given proper support and education, right? And then it goes on to say, motivated patients can follow diet and prevent cardiac events. So for me as a clinician, that was the most important sentence, right? Because for us, that's where the rubber hits the road. How do you actually do that? We know the research. The research is all there, and unfortunately, it's been around for so long, and we haven't done much with it as a society. But for me as a clinician, that's really where the challenging lies, is right. How do you motivate individuals to take on these recommendations and actually implement them? And that's what we encounter every day as clinicians, right? It's not as easy as saying, hey, the research says this, you shouldn't do this, you should do this instead, right? So as clinicians, we actually have to take that information and we have to recognize, okay, what population is in front of me, what individual is in front of me, and do what we do best, right? Use our clinical skills to examine and work with an individual. What are your barriers? How can I help you implement this, right? Because it's not as easy as just flipping a switch and all of a sudden everyone is going to eat a fully plant-based meal. We all know that's not true. We can't do that ourselves, right? Many of us can't commit to exercising every day, for the recommended amount of time, or eating the way we're supposed to be eating. And so we have to recognize that, and specifically within the populations we work with. So for myself, I work with Dr. Morris mentioned my program, the USC Fit Families program. And so we work with the community of East LA, Boyle Heights specifically. That's the area surrounding the University of Southern California medical campus where the PT school is located. And what we have found in our work with that community really reflects what the literature says, right? The influence of there are societal influences that are challenging for our folks. There are environmental influences that are challenging for our folks. There are cultural barriers and challenges that our folks have. There's perception barriers, right? How people perceive food. I wrote down a couple words here that we in our program, we try not to use, right? Because it has a specific connotation, many of them a negative connotation, right? So we don't use the word diet when we talk to people about nutrition. We don't use, the word vegan because it has a very negative connotation. There were audible gasps when you mentioned that, right? In this audience, so we don't use that word. So we really have to understand, what is the cultural context that each person is living in, and really tailor our interventions. Our end goal is the same, okay? But as clinicians, where we come in, where we're uniquely positioned to do this, is we have this superpower, right? And our superpower is that we get to spend tons of time with patients and really explore them as individuals, the communities they live in, and try to help them overcome and address some of the challenges we have both personally, but also in their neighborhoods from a policy perspective. So I'll stop there. Those are my initial thoughts.
Wonderful. Please join me in thanking the panel. We chose the right group, huh? So we'd like to open it up for questions now.
I'll ask the question, so you don't sit there.
Thank you, Kendall.
I talked about, and the story, if you go back, you think about how corn first got hired, right? So how many people that come into the clinic, to your point, if I'm in East LA, if I'm in New York, if I'm somewhere where the closest farm is, let's say 150 miles, just, I don't know where that exists, but let's just use
The screen
even if I get that person to be willing to make that shift, how then do I actually connect them to resources that make that possible? When you've been seeing back in the US does not currently produce healthy enough food at the amounts necessary to support a lifestyle like that. And how do I then connect that to the idea that movement informs on health? It also changes health and impacts health. So how do I take that big idea for that person who hadn't moved since 1975? And the fact that the things that I want them to eat, the things that are recommended, the things that you said, moderation kills, how do I move them even with willingness? How do I create that environment that supports that change that I want to do?
I'll start and then I'll pass it to anyone. And so I have witnesses here. I literally wrote, I'm gonna read what I wrote during the talk. I have a witness. Need to help establish an infrastructure that promotes plant-based or healthy eating and physical activity pattern. That's literally what I wrote while I'm listening to the presentation, right? So that kind of goes back to this. So the one area where I will disagree with Dr. King, it's not true. But it's this concept that, you know, there's no such thing as moderation. Well, I'm gonna say in the context of implementing, that's where moderation is helpful, right? Because you can't just flip the switch. It doesn't go from 0 to 100, right? So I wrote a couple things, right? So what is that infrastructure consist of? Because we gotta start small, right? We all know that you can't just go home, empty your fridge and put new stuff in there and all of a sudden it's gonna be great. It doesn't work like that. Safe neighborhoods, right? So us as physical therapists, that's where we come in, advocating for safe neighborhoods, advocating for access to those healthy foods. One of the things we did in East LA, actually, we went around the neighborhood. Well, Dr. Cheryl, a resident who I work with, went around the neighborhood. She reached out to the neighborhood and found out, okay, who are the movers and shakers of this community? And it turned out it was these group of, she called them the militant moms. There was this group of moms, right, in the neighborhood, who they were the ones that really ran the show there. So she was able to reach out to this group and said, hey, let's walk the neighborhood. And guess what? Let's rate the quality of the fruits and vegetables and all. There's no supermarkets, right? It's liquor stores. Let's rate the quality of these foods and we're going to make them public, right? So, you know, this type of advocacy, if you have to start by shaming the local grocers into getting better products, you know, you got to start somewhere. And that's actually what she did. She went around and rated all the local grocers. And guess what? Once the other ones heard that, hey, if they're saying that this grocer down the street sells better products, guess what appeared on their shelves? Within a couple of weeks, they started, you know, buying better products. You know, so you got to start somewhere. We talked about the policy perspective, right? So while we're working with the individual on small changes, right? Small gradual changes to get them to that endpoint, we're also working in parallel on policy. How do our institutions talk about food and what foods are available, so on and so forth. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but it's just about, you gotta begin somewhere. Just like when you try to change your eating pattern, you don't change everything all at once. Well, you can't change society all at once either. And you just have to pick what's there for you, reach out to people that can help and start that process.
Could I let me just address that. So, almost agree. Transparency is everything. Patients should know. The public should know. Yes, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but some patients will change overnight, depending on their motivation. I don't think we should make assumptions about our patients. I think that's a really slippery slope. My patient won't do it, or they need this kind of incremental program. It's the discussion with the patient. Some will change. I've seen them change. I'm not sure if Dr. Harrison, if it was a rapid change, but he had a wake up call. And things changed, you know, that the kitchen was rebooted. So I think it's, again, coming back to dialogue, what's going to work for they need to know the science, they need to know what they're up against, and that, you know, some of their decisions are going to impact that. But as one of the slides said, and I so resonated to it, it's, you know, we set up the patient, and we set up the public to live in a certain environment, and then it's almost blaming them for getting into health difficulties, and that they then suddenly have to take responsibility. Well, that kind of seems like a very double-edged sword to me. I mean, it's a no-win situation. So I think that, again, policy, those of you who are interested in policy, you know, let's march up to the plate and help to make these changes that will change the food availability. And it's not necessarily going to be easy. I'm not suggesting that, but what I wanted to present, of course, was just the science today. Let us think about how this might be best done.
So our center, you know, I'm speaking from the standpoint of a clinic where people come to me, so I'm not in the community, and each scenario is different. But I think in a clinic scenario, you really need to set up a culture of wellness, and you have to lead by example, and you just have to show that message to everyone and make sure that it's clear. And I think my message is hardened over the years for a reason, because when I was ravaged with heart disease, I was put on the DASH diet. So what do? You look at the DASH diet and you go, oh, salmon's allowed on the DASH diet. So what did I do? I ate salmon every night. One of the fattiest, most horrible fish you could eat for heart disease. So no one gave me this information. That's my argument. No one is giving you this information. I had to find it on my own. And so don't water down the message. That's my main message. They need to know the truth. Whether they follow it or not is up to them.
I have a question.
I have a question. Or you, please.
I'm older, all the I'm shocked by how the obesity rate is so high. And I'm seeing a lot of my patients are usually on blood pressure medications and, you know, it's terrible, but I don't even know where to find resources to tell them what to eat. When I go to the clinic manager and I say, we're my diabetes education, my husband's diabetic. So, you know, he went way down on carbs, but they recommend high carb diets, you know, like when I have zero high carb diet, maybe 2 or 3 servings of carbs per meal. Or like 45 grams of carbs per meal, and I think that's too high, you know, from what my husband and I've done, but I don't, so you know, it's great to say, read all these books. I'm not gonna read all those books.
Just read one.
Out there that just says, this is a healthy diet for Latino people.
If I could just address that, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine has a whole Latino section. There's an Indian section, there's a Chinese section, and to make these changes culturally relevant. So check pcrm.org and just follow the links and you'll find it.
I don't know those resources and I appreciate them. I'm gonna look them up, but I will say not all Latinos are different, are the same. Just like not all any group is the same, right?
And if
So
mine are mostly Mexican, almost like 100%.
right, so I would tap into the individual's culture, history, their own personal diet currently, and then see where changes can be made in that too. And I think that's part of my point with like the local food, right? I grew up in a time where strawberries had a season. You couldn't go any time of year and get a fresh strawberry, like June to whatever was the strawberry season. We don't do that anymore because we grow our food differently, right? We use preservatives differently. Milk stays good for 2 weeks. That's weird to me, right? That's not how it was when I was growing up. And so I think there's also what's in our food, not just which foods we pick. And I don't think that we really discussed that as much today, but I think that's a huge factor. There's a great couple of series, TV series, Netflix type things. If you haven't seen The Food That Built America, highly recommend. Also, foods or shows like High on the Hog that speak to specific cultural diets over time, I think are helpful ways to better understand the diets of the groups that you work with. So resources all day, I'm gonna go look at myself, but I want to encourage you that not everybody's gonna look the same in a group as big as Latino or Asian or Black.
I'll add one last thing. So, our participants were really our biggest resource, because they know what's in their neighborhood, right? And so every time that we created a new recipe for them, we would actually bring it, but we bought everything down the street. So it would have been disingenuous for us to go to Whole Foods before and grab, all this stuff, because there's a Whole Foods within 50 miles of some of these neighborhoods. Right, so we actually would go down the street and just buy whatever was available. This is what you have in your own neighborhood, so let's work here. What can we do? So that show and tell is very important as well.
Also is creating demand. I mean, if you get these people wanting whole fresh food, it'll happen. They'll make it happen. It's got to create demand. They got to know that that's what they need to get well.
Okay, I have a question in kind of an end to preface my question, as I previously lived in Iraq and in Indonesia. And in both of those places in kind of the large urban areas that have been urban and temporary for several decades. There's high incidence of these non-communicable diseases that we're talking about now, high incidences of obesity and fast food, corporatized food, modern agriculture, modern food distribution practices exist. But in rural communities where I spent time in those countries, very low instances of non-communicable disease. But in both of those contexts, in Iraq, it's very agrarian, lots of vegetables, but also lots of goats. That's shepherding culture, lots of chicken. In Indonesia, in the more coastal rural areas, lots of rice, lots of vegetables, but also fish and meats from the sea are huge staples. And so I'm curious, in the literature that we have, is kind of the source of meat products and the quality of those meat products a variable that's considered in the literature? To kind of explain that, just knowing, these communities have eaten this way for thousands of years.
Yes, there have been, because what we've done to meat production and the way they're raised and, for a certain degree of fat content and the animals you're talking about are leaner. And indeed, people have adapted, we are adaptable, we can live in the north, we can live off blubber, we can live in the societies that you're talking about, but it's not maximizing our health. So we can do these things. And coming back to, is the green meat be better? Well, in some respects, it probably is. But when you're looking at how we're actually constructed, we're not designed to consume protein that way. So, good observation. I'm glad you've had those experiences, because I think that will serve you well as a clinician, seeing those differences in terms of non-communicable disease risk. Did anybody want to add to them?
Add to that kind of goes back to the point about the industry and how it was created in this country, and the difference between families who grew up with gardens or when the chickens were running around the yard, not inside a cage, right? Or same with the goat, right? If they're eating natural, local, plant-based diets, right? I think I don't have the research to support this, but I can point to the books that let me think about the difference between the health of that cow versus that cow, or that goat versus that chicken versus that chicken. I think the same could be said about fish. We often talk about sort of this halfway point between omnivores and herbivores being like a pescatarian type of thing, but that depends too. Some fish are farm raised and have much of the challenges that a farm raised chicken would have versus a wild caught fish of the same species. So I think it's a lovely question, and I think it's something that should be interrogated more.
And I think where your food comes from does matter. I mean, to what was just mentioned, and also thinking about how those plants are grown. You know, what's that soil content look like? That's one of the things that a lot of people don't think about. Because in some cases, you can't take a banana and compare it to another banana that was maybe grown in a different country, in a different climate, in a different soil. So when you go to the website and you find out how much potassium does this banana give me that's medium size, you can't really take that to heart because you don't really know. Because the contents of that banana, that plant that you're eating really depends on where it's grown and what that soil had to offer. So you start getting into a lot of nuances. Personally, I try not to think about that stuff. I'm trying to be a little bit more of a realistic person. You know, one of the other things to consider about nutritional research is it's organically flawed in many components and how it's put together. Research in general, but nutritional research is highly flawed. A lot of the studies, they rely on self-reporting, right? You look at even the big data sets of studies, it's food frequency questionnaires for the most part. And if you look at some of these, you know, if you look at the alternative healthy eating index, it's a lot of questions. Okay. So it's up to that person responding to that survey that they're being 100% accurate, that they're remembering what they're eating, or they're being completely honest in what they're eating. So that's just the nutrition component too. But then you have to think of when you look at health outcomes, when you look at that risk of cardiovascular disease, yes, we know nutrition is related to that. Yes, we know that movement is related to that. We are now learning more and more that how people sleep related to that. How they manage stress is related to that. Then you take an even greater step back and you say, well, it matters what zip code they live in as well, because of the resources that they have access to. Studies don't look at all of that information, and when they have the ability to do so, it's very small sample sizes. So it's just that's my biggest issue with nutritional research in general, is because there's so much unknown. There are so many factors that are at play that it's hard to say it's just what a person is eating that's causing those outcomes.
In terms of the behaviors, right? Going back to, I'm sorry, what is your name? Daniel. So Daniel, you're describing, you know, that the scenario here. I started thinking about, you know, when I travel around the country too, and I look, you know, and I see what you know, the indigenous cultures, you know, do. They live very differently. And so I'm going to go back again, because in preparation for this, I went back to some of my articles that I had, you know, here about the cultural perceptions of food, because that also plays a huge role. And again, going back to that, you know, I found this article that talked about the cultural perception of healthy eating in Mexican American and Latino immigrant communities, right? Right, not individuals who were born in the United States, but the perception of healthy food by those who come, like myself. I was not born in the United States. I came to the United States as an immigrant, and there's different perception even amongst Latinos, as you were saying. Not all Latinos are homogeneous. Even that subset of folks who come to the United States, they perceive food differently, right? And I wrote it here, and this is something that our participants tell me, some that my friends who travel to the United States from other countries tell me. This, you know, the healthy food that we consider, right, legumes and, you know, beans, rice. In my country, black beans and rice, like that's all the time. But black beans and rice, someone, you know, said, oh, that's poor people's food, right? So when you come to the United States as an immigrant, you're here to make it, right? I'm not going to eat poor people's food. I'm going to eat what everyone else is doing, right? And that cultural perception is a problem too. And that's something that we have to face head on with our patients, because we can't ignore, right, the fact that people have specific perceptions about what food means as well. Yes, absolutely, the environmental, the culture, everything is related. This is just one more layer on top of that we have to consider when we work with our patients and trying to understand how the behavior changes.
Yes.
One point related to the Black beans and rice. I do work in Haiti. Haiti is 95% Black country. Black beans and rice, 54, right, is the like main dish there. Still high incidence of cardiovascular disease, high incidence of hypertension. I'm treating mostly stroke patients, even though I'm a generalist and not there to be a neurospecialist. Those are the people coming in my door. Same diet as Guatemala, different outcomes, similar outcomes to other Black people, right? So diet is what's going on in that situation, but not the whole story.
So. It's your.
Dr. Capalugo.
One is offer some information for the people in Birmingham. There is a farm called Thompson Heights Farm. It is an urban farm managed by Black farmers, and they do a lot more than farming. It's an organic farm. They accept volunteers. They teach people how to eat certain foods, and they provide a lot of food for free or a low cost, and they connect people to services. So if you're practicing in Birmingham and you need a place to go, Thompson Heights Farm is a short walk from the Civil Rights Institute. That's one piece of information. The second is that there are a lot of community gardens in Birmingham. I lived in Norwood, and we have a well-managed community garden. Norwood is primarily a Black community, Latina, and so a lot of the vegetables and things that they would grow, I wouldn't eat because I don't know how to eat them. But I learned a lot, and I kind of learned what these dishes, and so that is to say that, you know, a Black community, mixed income, the food, we produced over 300 pounds of food in a few months, and nothing went bad. The community won it, right? So I struggle with the idea sometimes like, oh, if you show them, they'll accept it and learn to cook it. It's like people want it. And there's a desire, but the system and the way it's built and the things that we have accessible don't allow always for a healthy meal. And then the question. So my first introduction to food and physical therapy is actually through trauma and scarcity and having conversations about how could we provide any food to people who have nothing, right? So right now I'm in Puerto Rico, so when we think hurricane, then that's what we need. Canned foods, terrible for healthy diet. But what do we want to do? So my question is, 10, 15 years from now, what is your dream in terms of physical therapy and food? What are we aiming for? What is our goal?
I think that's kind of the purpose of sessions like this, in my view, is because it's not going to be one individual. It's going to be, I think, there's going to be need for a collective of people who are in agreement about a way forward, you know. And I think those are the issues that need to be discussed. Policy, of course, it's really, in many ways, the individual can do a lot, but it's policies and it's availability, it's access, it's education and being transparent. You know, people certainly have a choice. They don't have to do these things. We all have a choice, but you know, those can be limited by our environment. And how is it that we can work toward creating an environment where healthy food is both more accessible and more valued, because you know, the corporate influence has been quite successful in barring that information. For example, and I didn't even get into this, there are many other things I could have discussed, but there should be a sign in your processed meat section of your superstore. Tell me if the sign is there. Class 1 carcinogen from the International Agency for Cancer Research. This is an independent body. This is nonprofit. We have tobacco. They are that. Thank you. You know, that'd be fair to people be able to make a choice, at least, about what they're buying. Red meat is a class 2 carcinogen. That's a public aware. You know, this is an independent world level body that, you know, these products are up there with tobacco, plutonium, asbestos. You know, these things we kind of are aware of, but, you know, so I'm very committed to the transparency of what the public is having access to and what information they're being given. And so in terms of a long range plan, it's going to be the next generation. We're reliant, you know, maybe a path you choose, it may not be, it may be one that you think, no, other people can do this. I personally don't. That's why I'm here today speaking on this topic. Thank you.
I think we could be the quarterback of the healthcare team. I think we can be the quarterback of the healthcare team, where we're able to have someone come in, walk through the door, and help dictate where they need to be and who the best person is that they should see. So in doing that, we've got to have enough information, enough knowledge to be a bit dangerous with it, to give that patient enough to share some of the knowledge that may be hidden. But then if we're not the person that can continue that conversation, we need to know where to direct that care. And that goes for any health behavior, anything within this realm that we're speaking about, any type of health equity, etc. We've got to have enough knowledge to be dangerous and then dictate where that person needs to go. Because if you think of why people enter the healthcare system, we know for the majority part, it's musculoskeletal related, right? They're going to the ER because they got low back pain, etc. Why can't we be that quarterback of the healthcare team so we can help mitigate that and really keep people out of the healthcare system in many ways? But you've got to have enough knowledge and enough base foundation in order to do so. I'm going to pose a question though, just a show of hands. Who's comfortable talking about nutrition with a patient? Okay, that's decent, that's fair, right? And look, if you didn't raise your hand, that's totally fine. That's totally fine. However, I do believe you've got to have that base knowledge in order to screen, in order to discover whether or not it is important to that patient, determine if there's a need, and then you have to be able to decide whether or not you continue that conversation or whether or not you put that conversation in the hands of someone else. But you also have to be knowledgeable enough of the resources that are in your community. And coming back to, for some reason, I knew Kendall was going to be back there asking these hard questions, right? But you've got to know your community resources. You've got to know what's available. You have to know the people in the community that run the show. That's the only way you're going to get anything done. It's the only way you're going to get your message out there. You have to know what is available and where to direct people. I just moved here. I've been here 6 weeks in Birmingham. You'll probably see a lot more of me at some point, but I'm writing down the Fountain Heights Farm. I'm gonna start looking up all these community gardens, right? I'm gonna be diving into the resources within this city to really see where we can take things now that I'm setting roots here. But you've got to do the work. But it all starts with, you've got to have just enough information to be dangerous to start that conversation, because you never know what fire you're gonna light. And you never know what conversations are going to come from it and how you could potentially change someone's life. Because I'm gonna tell you what, if the physical therapy profession relies solely on just trying to improve people's pain and address their functional impairments, we're not going to be around for very long.
Dr. Hawkins. Yeah, that's you.
You said something that I love that you said. Do it in there, but we kind of fly over, kind of like we're doing physical therapy. You say ER, right? So we're talking about community implementing, we're talking about outpatient, they come in my clinic, but we fly over the inpatient setting. And I'm a little biased for working acute care, but a lot of the time, those are sick patients. So how do we implement this healthy mindset and change the narrative in these large infrastructures we truly don't care about implementing? Because as a student, not to point them out, but I kind of brought up the topic, even at UAB, we talk about healthy eating, but we offer fast food. I work on a stroke unit, but my patients can get 2 tea, non-caffeinated, they get sodas. And even the vegan diet is canned fruits and vegetables, nothing truly substantive. So how do you switch this mindset in the infrastructure where patients come to get health resources? They think this is, a place for them recovering, but at the end of the day, it's truly just a bit. So how do you think PT can truly, in this setting, when the patient is really more important because an outpatient and community resources, they come to, they walk in, they have a lifestyle. If you have these people in acute care, your SNFs, your inpatient rehab, who don't have a quality of life at this point, and where this information and lifestyle change can really be the most benefit.
And if you'll allow me to add on to Akil's question from the chat, we are unless we practice in the pre-rehab arena, like self-pay, proactive fitness, we are typically the secondary, if not tertiary providers trying to empower our clients to improve their outcomes with diet and activity. So I think it's related to what Akil's saying. Can you give us some ideas of how we deal with this situation?
I can say, if you're coming to see a radiation oncologist, you're in a tertiary healthcare situation. We see people who are ravaged with disease of all types. And so the important point is that you can turn these people around. You can emphasize to them that big changes in your diet will make big differences in your outcome. I have patients that grasp this. They just do better. They get through treatment better. Their side effects are less. Their counts don't drop as low. They have more energy. They get through treatment easier. So you can show by example again and make your environment conducive to that learning.
So
I agree with the answer, and you said it perfectly, but even at your clinic, your patients come to your appointment. We're saying they can't make it to your appointment.
Yeah, it's hard. Folks going.
They're in the hospital setting, and this is kind of like, our healthcare bank our book, we're in the hospital. Right. How do you get these large institutions to really kind of switch their mind to like, okay, you guys keep talking while we're in the hospital?
Yeah, can I just quickly say, I mean, that's a really important issue because it's a very separate and distinct arena. And some hospitals have moved to plant-based kitchens. And so I think as an individual, it may be harder for you to, you're not going to talk to an ICU patient about improving their nutrition, but if you create the environment, a culture of health within that institution, and we did that in our clinic, we created a culture of health, there'd be posters, there'd be screens, we keep the door open for any kind of conversation, and patients sit in waiting rooms for a long time for these kinds of services. A waiting room is a great place to start implementing and being creative. I do this at the Health Sciences Center in Kuwait, where I lived and worked. And we're creating a culture of health in the Health Sciences Center. I'm afraid to say in oil-rich countries, diets have become dreadful and all these diseases are rampant, even in very young people. So creating a culture of health where we're educating these soon-to-be health professionals that they have to model health and to their patients to be credible and to engage in health promotion. But for the you must have a team. There are probably dietitians around. You can have these conversations, and when the patient gets to the acute care floor or is being discharged, there are teachable moments there for that individual and family. So I think it's being creative and knowing when to make this information available if they want it.
I hear you talking about systems change, and that requires advocacy, which is a skill that can be built. And that's why I think it's important that trainees in physical therapy, just like you're learning how to assess your patient, just like you're learning how to provide intervention, you learn how to do advocacy, whether that means to your hospital administrator, to your city council member, to your commerce person, or whatever, right? So that you know how to go about coalition building, how you can create theories of change, and how you can present those in a concise way to the decision makers or power players that are relevant for the issue that you're trying to address. And so if it's, bike helmet safety for kids in your neighborhood, to go this route. If it's getting healthier foods in the hospital, to go this route, and who you can bring along your way to do that advocacy. So that's something that I'm advocating for in physical therapy education, because right now our standards, our CAFD standards have advocacy in one little space, and it's a sentence with like 3 other things, like volunteerism, community something, advocacy, and whatever is my edit to that, right? Because that's how it feels. And so I think that this skill building around advocacy is a gap that we have, as well as an opportunity.
And you pair that with curriculum content on nutrition, and you've got a winning.
So, so it's interesting, right? Advocacy is actually in our code of ethics, but I'm hearing you say it's a very small part of CAPTI, right? So this kind of goes along to your question where, if you look big picture, we have a problem of messaging, right? We're saying one thing, we're doing another. Again, our code of ethics says that we have to advocate at all different levels, but CAPTI says there's one sentence on it. That's a messaging problem, right? We're not being consistent with what we say we should do and what we're actually doing. And so going back to the advocacy piece in the hospital, right? We were talking about this before about, I worked in inpatient rehab, stroke for many years. And I was just sharing with the doctor before we started today that I would go in, after breakfast to get the patient ready for rehab, and they were finishing up their bacon and egg breakfast and they just had a stroke. That's a problem with messaging, we in many instances, many institutions, like our actions don't align with what we say we're doing for patients, right? And it's important for us to know how to advocate at different levels. Yes, there's a policy advocacy track. There's a local administrative institution track, but honestly, the most important one I found is the patient. We got to activate the patients. And I do this not just with, with this issue, but any issue that my patients encounter. I know what I need to do as a clinician within my institution for getting this to the attention of people that need to hear it. But I also say, now, this is your ability to advocate as well. And these are the phone numbers you want to call. This is a person you want to do. Get on social media, do this, do that. Here's the website for the comments and the complaint line for the Department of Insurance in the state of California. Like, I actually do this, whether the complaint is against me or anybody, it doesn't matter, right? I'm teaching the patients how to advocate, and that's something that they're not used to doing. They're used to showing up to their provider and getting told what to do, right? Take this, come back and see me in 6 months, and that's what they're used to. So we also have to advocate to change the mindset of patients. It's a skill. Advocating is a skill, just as it is for us a skill, it is also for our patients, especially because they're used to a system where they're not, they're not encouraged to advocate for themselves. It's really about like, come in, see me, I'm gonna give you a pill, and you're just gonna come back, and that's what you're gonna do, right? So that is a special skill as well that we have to promote within our patients.
As much as I hate to do it, I'm going to have to stop the discussion. I'm sure this can continue out in the hallway. So I would like to thank our amazing panelists and Dr. Dean. And I'd also like to present Dr. Dean a little plaque here commemorating the lecture. And that concludes tonight's session. Thank you very much for joining us.